When Philip emailed me about 2 weeks ago asking me to fill in for Dennis today, the first thing I did was look at the assigned text in the Revised Common Lectionary for this first Sunday after Christmas. Although when I was growing up in this church, pastors did not use this 3-year cycle of readings, I've come to appreciate its value in planning worship. I like knowing that on any given Sunday, Christians in many different denominations, probably all the churches in this town, are reading, thinking, and praying about the same scriptures. It gives us reason to talk with one another about our faith and reminds us that we are all part of a wider Christian community. There are always 4 texts in the lectionary for a given Sunday. A psalm, a reading from the Hebrew Scriptures of the Old Testament, a reading from the New Testament or the Gospel, and an epistle reading. I like to use all texts in a service, and sometimes it's a challenge to see how they all fit together around a common theme. I decided today that we could sing a hymn based on Psalm 148, the Psalm for the Day, as our first gathering song. And I could use some lines from the epistle reading, which was from Colossians, in the call at the beginning of the service. But when I saw the other 2 scriptures, I was puzzled. Why should we be reading stories about the prophet Samuel as a child and Jesus as a boy on this particular Sunday? We have just celebrated the birth of Jesus a few days ago, and we'll be reading about the visit of the wise men as we near Epiphany. This story of Jesus is out of chronological order. Well, the answer is that the lectionary, over its 3-year cycle, assigns the few stories that we have of Jesus' childhood to these Sundays between Christmas Day and Epiphany, which is January 6th. The story of Jesus is paired with the story of Samuel because of the way they were both nurtured in the temple. Jesus in the temple at Jerusalem, and Samuel at the temple in Shiloh. However, for me as a preacher, there was a more challenging question. How is God speaking through these particular stories to us today? What is God saying to us in these strange times in which we live, when anger, anxiety, and fear are so pervasive throughout our culture? As I reread the 2 scriptures again and again, I kept putting myself in the place of Hannah and Mary, the mothers of Samuel and Jesus. Perhaps that's to be expected when a woman preacher looks at the Bible. But after all, I'm a mother and a grandmother too, and I identified with their fears and concerns for their sons. Let's consider Hannah first. For many years, she had been ridiculed and scorned by her husband's other wife because she had not borne him a child. Hannah had prayed earnestly for a son and promised to give him to God if her prayers were answered. After Samuel was born and weaned, probably between the ages of 2 and 4, Hannah kept her part of the bargain. She brought him to live with Eli, the old priest at the temple in Shiloh, to learn from him and be his helper. From that time on, Hannah saw her son but once a year, when she came with her husband to sacrifice at the temple. Each time she brought Samuel a new set of clothes that she had made for him. Though God blessed Hannah with 5 more children, she must have worried about her firstborn son. Would an old man be able to care for his needs? Would the priest's scoundrel sons be a bad influence on the child? What dangerous task did God have in mind for Samuel? Hannah must have been anxious and fearful for her child's safety and future, yet she had a mature faith and trusted that God would care for him. Samuel accepted his lot and grew in stature and in favor with the Lord and with the people. Mary, on the other hand, had become a mother at a younger age, much younger age, and kept her firstborn close to her. She had little patience with her 12-year-old son, but he disobeyed his parents and stayed behind in Jerusalem when the pilgrims from Nazareth had started home after the Passover celebration. Keep in mind that Nazareth is in the Galilee, over 90 miles northwest of Jerusalem. The closest route between the two cities would have been through Samaria, a mountainous area where people were hostile to Jews like the pilgrims from Nazareth. Mary and Joseph probably would have followed the Jordan River Valley for almost 70 miles down to Jericho, which was a desert oasis town 800 feet below sea level. Then they would have trudged up 3,300 feet to Jerusalem, which was in the mountains. As late as 1998, when I was on that lonely, dusty Jericho road, our tour bus struggled with the steep grade, and the sides of the road dropped off so quickly that some of my fellow passengers sat facing the aisles instead of the windows because they didn't like heights. It was not a road that I would have wanted to travel by walking, but walking was the common mode of transportation for the pilgrims from Nazareth. At the rate of maybe 20 miles a day, the trip to and from Jerusalem would probably have taken at least 5 or 6 days each way, with no hotels, restaurants, or restrooms along the road. Families in those days traveled in groups for companionship and safety. Along the way, most likely other families joined them on their way to Jerusalem for the Passover. And when they started home after the celebration, it would have been natural for the pilgrims to mingle and share their experiences as they walked. Mary and Joseph could easily have assumed that Jesus was somewhere in the group with friends or relatives his own age. But of course, he had stayed behind in Jerusalem. By the time they discovered he was missing, they had already traveled one day, just long enough to have gotten back down the hill to Jericho. Mary quickly realized they would have to return to Jerusalem to look for their son. You can imagine her consternation at having to climb up that steep and lonely road again. Joseph wasn't getting any younger, and this would be hard on him. Add that worry to her worry, add that her anxiety and fear as to what might have happened to Jesus. Had he been injured along the road? Had robbers assaulted or kidnapped him? Had he lost his way in the crowds of Jerusalem? Countless what-ifs must have run through Mary's mind. For the first time, her son had disobeyed her. She was losing control over his life. Who would keep him safe now? For 3 days after they arrived in Jerusalem, Mary and Joseph searched for Jesus up and down the narrow streets of the city. They finally found him in the temple, innocently talking with the rabbis, asking questions of these teachers, listening to their answers, reflecting on their thoughts. This was too much for Mary. "Child, why have you treated us like this?" she exploded angrily. "Your father and I have been searching for you everywhere. We've been worried sick about you." Jesus seemed completely oblivious to the worry and anxiety he had caused his parents, to say nothing of the inconvenience. He calmly replied, "But didn't you know that I must be here in my Father's house, going about my Father's business?" Jesus' words made little sense to his angry, worried parents at the time, but they were so relieved to find their son that their anger soon dissipated. Jesus obediently left with them to return to Nazareth, and there, like the young Samuel in Shiloh, he increased in wisdom and in years and in divine and human favor. Mary remembered Jesus' words in the temple, but it was probably not until much later that she began to understand what he was trying to tell her that day in Jerusalem. Jesus, now 30 years of age, was asked to read from the scriptures in the synagogue at Nazareth, and he chose to quote from the prophecy of Isaiah. "I have been anointed to bring good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Jesus went on, "Today this prophecy has been fulfilled." With these words, Jesus was for the first time publicly claiming his calling from God, a calling he had begun to discern when he was 12, through his discussions in the temple with the rabbis. Mary now understood that her son had special work to do for God in the world, and her fears for his life must have been rekindled when she saw the people of Nazareth reject him and drive him out of town. But Jesus, unperturbed as usual, went his way unharmed and began to carry on his ministry. At this time in Palestine, anger, fear, and anxiety were probably as prevalent as these feelings are in our country today. The land was occupied by a foreign power, the Roman Empire, known for its cruelty and violence, and there were some who were urging a revolt against these rulers. People were divided along ethnic and religious lines. Jewish leaders were afraid of new ideas that threatened their traditions. Taxes for the temple and the empire were a heavy burden on the poor. Disease was a constant threat, especially leprosy, for which there was no known cure. There was anger, as there often is when people feel threatened and afraid. And there was much to be afraid of in the first century. Yet Jesus calmly and steadfastly went about doing the work God had given him, teaching, preaching, and healing the people, no matter who they were or where they were on life's journey. Every day he practiced what he preached. According to the gospel writers, Jesus gave his friends about 125 commands. In 8 of the commands tell us in one way or another to love our neighbor. But there are 21 on the theme of don't be afraid, fear not, have courage. Jesus trusted in God's way of love and refused to let fear get in the way of doing his Father's business. From the time he stood up as a man before his parents and the rabbis at the age of 12, he focused on the work God had called him to do, trusting that God was with him, no matter what. Admittedly, in this century, in this time, we have had plenty of causes for worry. Like Hannah and Mary, we are concerned about what the future, yet unknown, holds for our children and grandchildren, and all the children in the world. Yet we cannot let our fears distract us from the work God has called us to do as Christians. We need to ignore the politicians who would fan our fears and anxieties into mass hysteria, and listen instead to God speaking to us in this story of Jesus in the temple. Why are you so anxious and afraid to follow my way of love? God asks. I have given you work to do, and I will never abandon you. Trust in me and put aside your fears. Focus on business as usual, my friends. My business. Caring for the poor, the sick, the widow and orphan, the homeless, the prisoner, the refugee, the oppressed. Show them all the love and compassion and kindness you have known in Jesus. And let whatever you do, in word or deed, always be worthy of his name. Let us pray. O perfect love that casts out fear, embolden us, we pray. Draw near. Give us the faith in troubled days to live and love and sing your praise.